The gods were kind and it transformed him into a corpse. That's how Meister Aemon described the death of his brother, a prince, so deranged, so utterly consumed by madness that he literally drank wildfire believing it would turn him into a dragon. But before Prince Aerion Brightflame burned himself alive from the inside out, he terrorized Westeros with acts of cruelty that would make even Joffrey Baratheon and Ramsay Bolton seem like choir boys. Today, we're diving deep into the life of the most monstrous Targaryen prince you've never heard of. A man whose evil was so profound that even decades after his death, the mere possibility that his son might have inherited his madness was enough to deny that boy the Iron Throne. I'm talking about sexual threats against his own baby brother, torturing innocent people for entertainment, deliberately killing animals in front of crowds, and a descent into madness so complete that it would define the very concept of Targaryen insanity for generations to come. This is the story of Aerion Brightflame Targaryen, the prince who thought he was a dragon. Let's set the stage. We're talking about the year 191 to 194, roughly 90 years before the events of Game of Thrones. The Targaryen dynasty is still firmly in power, but the dragons, they've been dead for about 40 years. That little detail becomes very, very important. Prince Aerion. Targaryen was born the second son of Prince Maekar Targaryen and Lady Diana Dane. Now, being a second son in a royal family usually means you're close enough to power to taste it, but far enough away that you'll probably never have it. And for most people, that creates resentment. For Aerion, it created something far darker. From the very beginning, Aerion was blessed with the looks that made House Targaryen legendary. We're talking curly silver gold hair, deep violet eyes, pale unblemished skin, sharp cheekbones, and a face that chroniclers described as sculptured and imperious. The guy looked like he was carved from marble by the gods themselves. He was the fantasy book cover model come to life. But here's the thing about beauty, it can hide a multitude of sins. And beneath that perfect Valyrian exterior lurks something genuinely monstrous. Even as a child, Aerion displayed warning signs that should have sent every alarm bell ringing. His younger brother, Aegon, yes, that Aegon, the future Aegon the Unlikely, one of the greatest kings Westeros would ever know, later recalled the absolute terror of growing up with Aerion. And when I say terror, I don't mean typical sibling rivalry. I mean legitimate psychological warfare. Picture this. You're a young boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old. It's the middle of the night. You're asleep in your bed when suddenly you wake up to find your older brother standing over you in the darkness. And he's holding a knife, not just holding these, placing it between your legs while whispering that maybe one night he'll make you his sister so he can marry you. Yeah, let that sink in for a moment. This wasn't a one-time thing. Aerion would do this repeatedly to young Aegon, visiting him in the night with his blade and his threats. The psychological damage alone is almost unimaginable. This is your own brother, someone who's supposed to protect you, threatening you with mutilation and sexual violence as a child. But it gets worse, because Aerion didn't limit his cruelty to psychological torture. Young Aegon had a cat, a pet he presumably loved, the way children do. Aerion threw that cat down a well. When confronted about it, Aerion lied. Because of course he did. Cruelty and dishonesty went hand in hand with him. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's messed up, but lots of historical figures had troubled childhoods? True, but here's the kicker. Aerion wasn't some tormented soul acting out because of his own trauma. He was a calculating predator who knew exactly what he was doing. How do we know? Because whenever their father, Prince Maekar, was around, Aerion transformed. Suddenly, he was all smiles and courtesies. The perfect prince. Charming, polite, respectful. He understood social expectations well enough to manipulate them. He could turn his normal person mask on and off like a light switch. That's not a damaged kid lashing out. That's a psychopath learning to blend in. And the worst part? It worked. Maekar apparently had no idea what his son truly was, or perhaps he didn't want to see it. Either way, Aerion grew up largely unchecked, his monstrous nature hidden behind a beautiful face and courtly manners. But as Aerion grew older, that mask started to slip. Because the one thing Aerion couldn't hide, the obsession that would ultimately define and destroy him, was his absolute conviction that he was a dragon trapped in human form. Now, we need to talk about Aerion's central delusion, because this is what separates him from your typical cruel nobleman. This is what elevates him into the realm of genuine madness. Aerion genuinely, truly, completely believed that he was a dragon in human form. This wasn't metaphorical. He didn't think of himself as dragon-like or having the spirit of a dragon. No, Aerion was convinced that he was literally a dragon who just happened to be wearing a human body like a costume. And every single aspect of his life was designed to reinforce this delusion. His clothing, always bright as fire reds, yellows, oranges, and golds. His tournament armor, a surcoat woven with swirling patterns of smoke and fire. His helm, crested with red enamel flames. Even his lance was painted in stripes of red, orange, and yellow to look like flames. He didn't just dress like fire, he tried to embody it in every possible way. He even gave himself his own nickname, Brightflame, because apparently Aerion, the completely sane and definitely not delusional, didn't have the same ring to it. But here's where it gets really dark, because when you genuinely believe you're a dragon, you start to think of humans as fundamentally inferior beings, and when you think of other people as inferior, their suffering becomes meaningless to you. This is where Aerion diverges from villains like Joffrey and Ramsay. Joffrey was a sadistic brat who enjoyed causing pain. Ramsay was a calculating psychopath who weaponized torture, but both of them at least understood they were human beings interacting with other human beings. Aerion didn't see it that way. In his mind, he was a dragon. And what does a dragon owe to ants? Nothing. This mindset allowed Aerion to commit acts of cruelty without even the faintest whisper of conscience. Because in his warped worldview, he wasn't really hurting people. He was a superior being exercising his natural dominance over lesser creatures. His brother Daeron summed it up perfectly when he said, Aerion's quite the monster. He thinks he's a dragon in human form, you know. That's why he was so wroth at that puppet show. A pity he wasn't born a fossil way. Then he'd think himself an apple and we'd all be a deal safer. Even his own family recognized that Aerion's delusion made him dangerous, but recognition didn't equal action. Because Aerion was still a prince of the blood, he still had power, he still had protection, and he was about to use that power in the most public, brutal way imaginable. The year is 209 AC. Lord Ashford is holding a tournament to celebrate his daughter's 13th name day. It's a major social event. Knights from all over Westeros have gathered to compete, to see and be seen, to win glory and prizes. Enter Prince Aerion Brightflame, dressed in all his fiery splendor. Now, for context, this is the same tournament where we meet Sir Duncan the Tall and his squire egg secretly Prince Aegon Targaryen in disguise. Their story, The Hedge Knight, is one of the most beloved tales in the entire Song of Ice and Fire universe. And Aerion, he's the villain. But what makes Aerion such an effective villain isn't just that he's cruel. It's that his cruelty is so casual, so entitled, so utterly shameless. It starts when Aerion arrives at the tournament grounds and mistakes Dunk for a stable boy. He orders the massive hedge knight to take his horse. And when Dunk explains that he's actually a knight, Aerion scoffs at him with pure contempt. Because in Aerion's mind, a common-born hedge knight barely qualifies as human. But the real horror show begins during the actual jousting. Aerion is matched against Sir Humphrey Harding, one of the champions. It's supposed to be a test of skill and honor, the very foundation of knightly culture. But Aerion has other plans. As the two knights charge at each other, instead of aiming his lance at Humphrey's shield like you're supposed to, Aerion deliberately lowers his aim, and then he drives his golden-tipped lance directly into Humphrey's horse's neck. Let me paint this picture for you. A warhorse, a magnificent, powerful animal, is suddenly impaled through the neck by a lance. The horse doesn't die instantly. It screams, it thrashes in agony, and then it collapses, falling directly onto Humphrey, breaking the knight's leg and trapping him beneath a dying animal. This isn't an accident. Aerion's squire, Young Egg, immediately recognizes it as deliberate. The crowd can see it. Everyone knows what just happened. But Aerion just sits there on his own horse, completely unbothered, as if he's just swatted a fly. Think about the level of cruelty this requires. A warhorse isn't just an animal, it's a knight's partner, his most valuable possession, often worth more than everything else he owns combined. And Aerion killed it slowly, painfully, publicly, for no reason other than because he could. Prince Baelor Targaryen, the crown prince and one of the most honorable men in the realm, is so disgusted that he declares Humphrey the victor and gives the knight Aerion's own horse as compensation. It's a public humiliation of Aeriona Prince being overruled and embarrassed by his uncle in front of the entire tournament. For a normal person, this would be a moment of shame, a chance to reflect on your actions and maybe, just maybe, try to be better. For Aerion, it was gasoline on a fire. That night, there's a puppet show on the tournament grounds. It's simple entertainment, puppeteers performing a story about a brave knight slaying a dragon. Standard fare for medieval fantasy entertainment, right? Wrong. Because Aerion genuinely believes he is a dragon. And watching a dragon die, even a puppet dragon, is a personal insult to him. So what does Aerion do? He orders his men-at-arms to destroy the puppeteer's stall. They smash everything, the puppets, the stage, the props, complete destruction. But that's not enough for Aerion. One of the puppeteers is a young woman named Tansel. She's Dornish, which already makes her vulnerable in Westerosi society. She's a commoner with no protection, and she's just watched her livelihood destroyed by a raging prince. Aerion walks up to her, grabs her hand, and deliberately, methodically breaks her fingers one by one. Stop and think about that. He doesn't just hit her, he doesn't just threaten her, he takes the time to break each individual finger, maximizing her pain and her future suffering. Because how is a puppeteer supposed to work without functioning hands? This is where Sir Duncan the Tall enters the picture. Dunk sees this happening, and unlike the nobles standing around doing nothing, he acts. He charges at Aerion and beats the absolute hell out of him, punching him in the face, knocking out several teeth, kicking him in the stomach. It's one of the most satisfying moments in the entire Dunk and Egg series, but it comes with consequences. Because Dunk has just committed treason. You can't strike a prince of the blood, it doesn't matter what that prince was doing. The law is clear, and Aerion, bleeding and humiliated but still conscious, immediately orders his guards to arrest Dunk and declares that he wants the Hedge Knight's teeth broken with a hammer and his belly cut open. Yeah, Aerion's immediate response to being held accountable for his cruelty is to demand even more cruelty as revenge. It's only when Egg reveals himself as Prince Aegon Targaryen that Dunk is temporarily saved. But even then, Aerion isn't done, because Aerion understands the power of institutional authority. He goes to his father and claims that the puppet show was treason and incitement to revolt against House Targaryen. He demands Dunk's execution. And when Prince Baelor offers Dunk a trial by combat one, knight against one Aerion demands a trial of 7 instead. Why? Because a trial of 7 means 7 against 7, and Aerion knows that a hedge knight like Dunk will struggle to find 6 other knights willing to risk their lives for him. Meanwhile, Aerion can field 3 members of the Kingsguard, his own father, Prince Maekar, his brother, Prince Daeron, and other nobles he's bribed or pressured into service. It's a calculated move designed to ensure Dunk's death. Aerion is using the law itself as a weapon, perverting justice to serve his vengeance. The trial of 7 happens, and it's brutal. 3 men die during the combat, including the beloved Prince Baelor, Breakspear, killed accidentally by his own brother Maekar while Maekar was trying to get to Dunk. During the fight, Aerion himself puts his lance through Dunk's side and strikes him from his saddle, but ultimately, Dunk survives and gets the upper hand. With his sword at Aerion's throat, Dunk demands that the prince yield and recant his accusations. And Aerion does, because underneath all his bluster, all his cruelty, all his delusions of being a dragon, he's a coward. When faced with actual death, he folds immediately, but the damage is done. Prince Baelorthe, heir to the Iron Throne, one of the greatest knights and most honorable men in Westeros, is dead, and it's indirectly Aerion's fault. His cruelty, his persecution of Dunk, his insistence on a trial of 7 all of it, contributed to Baelor's death. Prince Maekar, guilt-ridden and furious, banishes Aerion into exile. The monstrous prince is sent away to Lys, across the narrow sea, expelled from Westeros and his family. You'd think that would be the end of the story, but Aerion Brightflame wasn't done terrorizing the world. Aerion's time in exile is shrouded in mystery. But what little we know is deeply disturbing. He ended up joining the second Sansone of the most famous mercenary companies in Essos. Now, think about what that means. Aerion wasn't just sitting in Lease drinking wine and feeling sorry for himself. He was actively working as a sellsword, which means he was killing people for money. And if you think Aerion was cruel when he had to maintain at least some veneer of princely behavior, imagine what he was like when he was working for a mercenary company where violence and amorality are practically job requirements. The text mentions that Aerion performed some actions that are known well but never explicitly detailed. That vague phrasing in George R. R. Martin's writing usually means something truly horrific that even the chroniclers didn't want to write down. Given what we know about Aerion, I shudder to think what those actions might have been. There are also hints that Aerion fathered bastard children during his time in Lease. Multiple children, in fact. And knowing Aerion's character, you have to wonder what the circumstances of those conceptions were. Did he have consensual relationships, or were these children the products of assault and abuse? Given his history of sexual threats and violence, the latter seems far more likely. Some fans have even speculated that young Griff, the supposed Aegon Targaryen from the main series, might actually be descended from Aerion's Lysine bastards rather than from Rhaegar Targaryen. It's an interesting theory, and it would add a dark irony to the story. The return of Aerion's bloodline to claim the throne. But here's the thing. Aerion didn't stay in exile forever. Eventually, he returned to Westeros. And when he did, he found himself involved in one of the most significant conflicts of his time, the Third Blackfyre Rebellion. For context, the Blackfyre Rebellions were a series of civil wars fought between House Targaryen and House Blackfyre, bastard branch of the family that claimed they were the true rightful rulers. These wars tore Westeros apart for generations. In the Third Blackfyre Rebellion, Aerion fought on the loyalist side, supporting King Aerys I Targaryen and the Hand of the King, Brynden Bloodraven Rivers. And according to the records, Aerion distinguished himself in this conflict, performing actions that were known well. Now, here's where things get really interesting. After the rebellion was crushed, the rebel leader Aegor Bittersteel Rivers was captured. Aerion and Bloodraven both pushed for Bittersteel to be executed, but King Aerys, in a moment of mercy, instead sent him to the Night's Watch, the leader of the opposing Blackfyre faction, a man named Haegon Blackfyre. And this is where things get dark because there are strong hints that Aerion personally murdered Haegon. Let me be clear, this wasn't an honorable death in battle. This was likely an assassination or an execution, and given Aerion's track record, it probably wasn't quick or painless. So now we have Aerion, a man who has psychologically and physically tortured his own siblings, sexually threatened a child, killed animals for sport, deliberately maimed an innocent woman, caused the death of Prince Baelor Breakspear, worked as a mercenary, doing gods know what in Essos, quite possibly murdered Haegon Blackfyre, and yet he was allowed back into Westeros. He was allowed to marry, specifically, his cousin Princess Daenora Targaryen, because incest was still very much the Targaryen way. And in 232 AC, he had a son. He named that son Maegor. Now, if you know your Targaryen history, that name should send chills down your spine. Maegor the Cruel was one of the most vicious kings in Westerosi history, a man who tortured his wives, murdered his nephews, and built the Red Keep with secret passages specifically so he could murder the workers afterward to keep them secret. Naming your son Maegor is like naming him Adolf or Genghis. You're basically announcing to the world that you're hoping he becomes a tyrant. It's a deliberate provocation, a middle finger to everyone who ever opposed him. And true to form, people were terrified that young Maegor might inherit his father's madness. That fear would later play a crucial role in Westerosi history. But we'll get to that, because the same year his son was born, Aerion Brightflame finally met his end. And it was, fittingly, the most insane death imaginable. Picture the scene. Aerion is drinking with friends. He's had quite a bit of wine. And in his cups, his delusion, the core belief that has defined his entire life, comes roaring back with absolute certainty. I am a dragon, he declares. I am a dragon trapped in human form. And then he has an idea, a terrible, fatal idea. If I drink wildfire, he says, I will transform. The fire will unlock my true nature. I will finally become what I truly am. For those who don't know, wildfire is essentially medieval napalm. It's an alchemical substance used in warfare, sticky, impossible to extinguish, and so volatile that even Meisters handle it with extreme caution. It burns at temperatures hot enough to melt stone. It's one of the most dangerous substances in all of Westeros. And Aerion Brightflame, in his drunken, delusional confidence, drank a cup of it. What happened next was exactly what anyone with half a brain would expect. Aerion died screaming as the wildfire burned him from the inside out. Let that image sit with you for a moment. The pain must have been unimaginable. Wildfire doesn't just burn you, it consumes you. It would have burned his mouth, his throat, his esophagus, his stomach. Every internal organ would have been set ablaze. He would have been conscious for at least some of it, feeling his insides literally liquefying. Some might call it poetic justice. A man who spent his entire life inflicting pain on others, finally experiencing agony beyond measure. A prince who believed himself a dragon being destroyed by the very thing he associated with dragon's fire. Maester Aemon Aerion's own brother, who lived to be over 100 years old and served the Night's Watch with distinction, later said, "One night, in his cups, he drank a jar of wildfire, after telling his friends it would transform him into a dragon. But the gods were kind, and it transformed him into a corpse." The gods were kind. That's how Aemon described his brother's horrific death. Kind. Because even a death that agonizing was preferable to Aerion remaining alive. Think about what that says. Aemon was one of the gentlest, wisest, most compassionate men in Westeros. And he viewed his brother's death as a kindness not to Aerion, but to the world. The impact of Aerion's life and death rippled through history. When King Maekar died a year after Aerion, a great council was called to determine the succession. Aerion's son, Prince Maegor, had a legitimate claim to the throne. He was the grandson of a king, after all. But the lords of Westeros looked at this child, this innocent boy who had done nothing wrong, and said, "No, absolutely not. We cannot risk it." They feared that Maegor might have inherited his father's madness and cruelty. The trauma of Aerion's reign of terror was so severe that they denied a child his birthright purely because of who his father was. Instead, they chose Aegon, the unlikely Aerion's younger brother, the same egg who had been tortured and terrorized as a child. The boy who had grown up in Aerion's shadow became King Aegon V, one of the greatest and most beloved rulers in Westerosi history. So, in a twisted way, Aerion's evil created something good. His cruelty to Aegon gave Egg perspective on the suffering of common people. His monstrosity was so profound that it united the realm in determining to never let someone like him near power again. But make no mistake, that doesn't redeem Aerion. That doesn't make his victim's suffering worthwhile. It just means that even from the worst evil, sometimes good people can emerge and build something better. So now we come to the central question. Was Aerion Brightflame more evil than Joffrey Baratheon and Ramsay Bolton combined? Let's break down the comparison systematically. Joffrey Baratheon was a sadistic child king who had an innocent butcher's boy killed, tormented Sansa Stark psychologically and physically, ordered Ned Stark's execution, arguably triggering the entire War of the Five Kings, executed people on whims, shot prostitutes with crossbows for entertainment. Joffrey was cruel, petty, and lacked empathy. He was a spoiled brat with absolute power and zero restraint. But here's the thing. Joffrey was 13 years old when he died. He never had the chance to grow into his full potential for evil. We'll never know if he would have become worse with age or if he might have been curbed by age and counsel. Also, Joffrey's cruelty was reactive. He lashed out when angry or when he felt disrespected. He was a sadist, yes, but an impulsive, emotional one. Ramsay Bolton was a different beast entirely. Hunted women for sport, flayed people alive, psychologically broke Theon Greyjoy into reek, fed his own stepmother and infant brother to his dogs, raped Sansa Stark repeatedly. Ramsay was calculated, methodical, and creative in his cruelty. He didn't just kill people, he destroyed them psychologically first. He was a true psychopath who weaponized torture as a tool of control. Ramsay is probably the closest to Aerion in terms of methodical cruelty. But even Ramsay had a motivation. He wanted to prove himself legitimate, to secure his position, to be recognized. His evil had a twisted internal logic. Now let's look at Aerion Brightflame, scope of cruelty. Unlike Joffrey and Ramsay, whose cruelty was primarily inflicted in their home territories, Aerion terrorized people across multiple continents and over decades. From Westeros to Essos, from his childhood to his death, he left a trail of victims. Types of victims. Aerion didn't discriminate. He tortured his own siblings, family, knights and nobles, social equals, common people, innocent with no power, animals, beings incapable of understanding why they were suffering, even potentially his own wife and child, though this is less documented. Duration of evil. Joffrey was cruel for maybe 2-3 years of actual power. Ramsay's documented cruelties spanned perhaps a decade. Aerion's reign of terror lasted over 40 years from his childhood torments to his death in 232 AC. Psychological damage. Both Joffrey and Ramsay traumatized their victims, but Aerion traumatized his own brother so severely that even decades later, as a king, Aegon V still remembered those midnight visits with a knife. Body count. This is harder to quantify, but Aerion's time as a mercenary, his role in the Blackfire Rebellion, and his likely assassination of Hagen Blackfire suggest a body count that exceeds both Joffrey's and Ramsay's combined. Long-term impact. Here's where it gets really interesting. Joffrey's cruelty sparked a war, yes, but he didn't fundamentally change society. Ramsay's cruelty traumatized individuals but didn't reshape policy. Aerion's cruelty was so severe that it changed the laws of succession. It literally caused the Great Council to alter how they chose kings. His evil was so profound that it affected Westerosi politics for generations. Joffrey was a brat and Ramsay was a psychopath, but both understood reality. They knew they were human. They knew their victims were human. Aerion genuinely believed he was a dragon. That level of delusion made him more dangerous because it removed any last psychological barrier to cruelty. In his mind, hurting humans wasn't even wrong, it was just a dragon doing what dragons do. The intelligence factor. Joffrey was impulsive and stupid. Many of his worst acts were emotional reactions. Ramsay was cunning but ultimately self-destructive. His cruelty made him enemies that eventually destroyed him. Aerion was smart enough to hide his true nature from his father for years. He was politically savvy enough to manipulate the law, demanding a trial of 7 instead of single combat. He survived in exile and fought in wars. His intelligence made his cruelty more effective and more terrifying. The cowardice factor. When confronted with real danger, Aerion yielded. When Dunk held a sword to his throat, Aerion recanted everything. He was willing to inflict any amount of suffering on others, but the moment his own life was at stake, he folded. This actually makes him worse than Ramsay, who at least had the twisted courage of his convictions. Aerion was a coward who only tormented those weaker than himself. But here's the most damning comparison. The self-destruction factor. Joffrey was killed by poison murdered by others who wanted him gone. Ramsay was killed in battle, defeated by the forces arrayed against him. Both were taken out by external forces. Aerion killed himself through sheer delusion. No one had to defeat him. He literally burned himself alive from the inside out because he was that disconnected from reality. That's not just evil, that's evil wrapped in madness, so complete that it becomes almost incomprehensible. The question isn't really whether Aerion was evil, he objectively was. The question is, what does his evil tell us about power, madness, and the nature of cruelty? Aerion Brightflame represents the absolute worst of what can happen when 3 factors combine. 1. Unchecked power. As a prince, Aerion could commit acts that would have gotten anyone else executed, and he faced minimal consequences for most of his life. 2. Mental illness. Aerion's delusion wasn't just a quirk, it was a complete break with reality that made him incapable of empathy or moral reasoning. 3. Enablement. The system around Aerion, his family, the court, the societal structure allowed him to continue his cruelty far longer than should have been possible. This combination created a perfect storm of horror. But here's what makes Aerion's story particularly relevant. He's not fantasy. He's a reflection of real historical figures. Think about Caligula, who allegedly declared himself a god and tried to make his horse a consul, or Vlad the Impaler, who literally impaled thousands of people as psychological warfare, or any number of historical rulers whose mental illness combined with absolute power created nightmares for their subjects. Aerion is George R.R. Martin's way of showing us that the most terrifying villains aren't always the ones with the biggest armies or the most elaborate schemes. Sometimes, the most terrifying villain is simply a person with power who has completely lost touch with reality. Aerion also represents the central tragedy of House Targaryen, the madness that runs through their bloodline. There's a famous saying in Westeros: every time a Targaryen is born, the gods flip a coin. One side is greatness dragons, vision, the ability to unite kingdoms. The other side is madness, Aerion. Aerys II, Rhaegal, Daenerys' brother who abused her, and others. Aerion is perhaps the purest example of that coin landing on madnss. He had all the gifts a prince could want: beauty, education, status, opportunity, and he used every single one of them to inflict suffering. And here's the truly chilling part. Aerion's madness wasn't random. It was heritable. The Great Council feared it so much that they denied his son the throne. And they were probably right to do so, because the Targaryen madness is genetic, passed down through generations of incestuous marriages designed to keep the bloodline pure. In trying to preserve their dragon blood, the Targaryens created a genetic lottery where each generation risked producing another Aerion. For those excited about the upcoming HBO series, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, Aerion is going to be a central antagonist. Finn Bennett has been cast to play him, and if the show stays true to the source material, we're going to see one of the most genuinely disturbing villains in the entire Game of Thrones universe. But here's the thing. Aerion's evil is different from what we've seen before. He's not a scheming Littlefinger or a brutal mountain. He's a beautiful, charming prince who also happens to be completely insane and utterly without empathy. That makes him terrifying in a completely different way. Because with characters like Joffrey or Ramsay, you can see the evil on the surface. They don't hide it. But Aerion could smile and bow and say all the right things, and then break your fingers because you offended his delusion. The show has the opportunity to explore something really interesting. How do normal people like Dunk and Egg deal with someone like Aerion? How do you oppose evil when that evil has the full protection of the law and the crown? The ultimate answer. So to answer our original question, is Prince Aerion Brightflame more evil than Joffrey and Ramsay combined? I would argue yes, but with an asterisk. In terms of raw scope, the number of victims, the duration of cruelty, the psychological damage inflicted, and the long-term historical impact, Aerion exceeds both Joffrey and Ramsay. Aerion tormented people for over 40 years across 2 continents. He traumatized his own family. He caused the death of a crown prince. He changed succession laws through sheer fear of his legacy. And he did it all while genuinely believing he was a superior species. But here's the asterisk. Aerion's evil was inseparable from his madness. He genuinely did not perceive reality the way normal people do. That doesn't excuse his actions, mad or not. His victims still suffered, but it does mean we need to understand him differently than we understand Joffrey or Ramsay. Joffrey knew he was being cruel and enjoyed it. Ramsay knew he was being cruel and weaponized it. Aerion probably didn't fully comprehend that he was being cruel because in his mind, he was a dragon and humans were beneath his concern. That makes him in some ways even more dangerous because you can potentially negotiate with or manipulate someone. Like Ramsay, he has goals, desires, fears, but how do you negotiate with someone who doesn't even see you as the same species? Aerion's story raises uncomfortable questions that extend beyond the fantasy world of Westeros. When does mental illness become a moral excuse? Aerion was clearly mentally ill. His delusion was genuine. So do we hold him morally responsible for his actions the same way we'd hold a neurotypical person responsible? Modern psychology would probably diagnose Aerion with some combination of narcissistic personality disorder, delusional disorder, and possible psychopathy. These are real conditions that affect real people. But mental illness doesn't negate the harm caused to victims. Tancel's broken fingers hurt just as much whether her attacker was delusional or not. Aegon's childhood trauma was just as severe whether his abuser was mentally ill or not. The answer, I think, is that we can acknowledge Aerion's illness while still holding him accountable for his actions. Mental illness explains behavior, it doesn't excuse it. What responsibility do institutions have to protect people from the powerful? Aerion was able to commit his crimes because the system protected him. He was a prince. The law literally placed him above consequences for most of his life. This is a pattern we see throughout history. Powerful people, whether aristocrats, celebrities, politicians, or corporate executives, often face fewer consequences for their actions than ordinary people would. Aerion's story is a cautionary tale about what happens when institutions prioritize protecting power over protecting people. The only reason Aerion was eventually exiled was because he caused the death of someone even more powerful than himself, Prince Baelor. If he'd only ever hurt commoners and his younger siblings, he probably would have faced no consequences at all. How do we break cycles of abuse and trauma? The most interesting character in this whole story might actually be Aegon Vai, the boy who survived Aerion's abuse and grew up to become one of the greatest kings in Westerosi history. Aegon didn't let his trauma define him. He didn't become like Aerion. Instead, he used his experiences to develop empathy for the suffering of others. He became known as Aegon the Unlikely and later as Aegon the Fortunate. And he spent his reign trying to improve the lives of common people. That's remarkable. That's someone actively choosing to break the cycle of abuse rather than perpetuating it. But not everyone has Aegon's strength. For every person who survives trauma and becomes better because of it, there are countless others who are simply broken by it. We should celebrate survivors like Aegon without using them as a standard to judge other victims. Not everyone can turn their pain into purpose. Is redemption always possible? Some fans of Asoif like to look for redemption arcs. Jaime Lannister, Theon Greyjoy, Sandor Clegane, these are characters who did terrible things, but eventually tried to be better. Could Aerion have been redeemed? Honestly, I don't think so. Redemption requires 3 things. 1, recognition that you've done wrong. 2, genuine remorse for your actions. 3, sincere effort to change. Aerion never showed any of these qualities. He never acknowledged wrongdoing. He never expressed remorse, and he certainly never tried to change. Up until the moment he drank wildfire, Aerion believed he was a dragon who deserved to dominate lesser beings. There's no redemption arc there, there's just a trajectory of cruelty ending in self-destruction. And that's okay. Not every villain needs to be redeemed. Sometimes evil is just evil, and the best we can hope for is that it eventually destroys itself. What would Aerion do with modern technology? This is a terrifying thought experiment. Imagine if someone with Aerion's mindset had access to modern weapons, surveillance technology, and social media. A medieval prince could hurt dozens or maybe hundreds of people in his lifetime. But someone with Aerion's psychology and modern resources, the potential for harm would be exponentially greater. It's a reminder that the constraints on evil are often technological rather than moral. Aerion was as evil as his era allowed him to be. In a different time with different tools, who knows what he might have done. Let me give you my final verdict on Prince Aerion Brightflame and where he ranks among the villains of Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire. In terms of personal cruelty, Aerion ranks alongside Ramsay Bolton. Both were creative, methodical, and took genuine pleasure in causing suffering. Edge goes to Ramsay for sheer inventiveness, but Aerion maintained his cruelty longer. In terms of body count, Aerion likely exceeds both Joffrey and Ramsay due to his military service and mercenary work. We don't have exact numbers, but circumstantial evidence suggests dozens to possibly hundreds of deaths directly attributable to him. In terms of psychological damage, Aerion wins this category outright. The trauma he inflicted on his own brother lasted a lifetime. The fear of his legacy changed succession laws. His impact echoed through generations. In terms of societal impact, Aerion's cruelty contributed to the death of Prince Baelor Breakspear, which destabilized the line of succession and indirectly affected the entire realm. Neither Joffrey nor Ramsay had that level of lasting impact. In terms of pure madness, Aerion is in a category by himself. Joffrey was cruel but sane. Ramsay was psychopathic but functional. Aerion was genuinely completely disconnected from reality. If we're ranking on a scale of 1 to 10, Joffrey Baratheon, 7 to 10, cruel, sadistic, but young and somewhat controlled by others. His evil was reactive and impulsive. Ramsay Bolton, 9 to 10, methodical, creative, and effective in his cruelty. A true psychopath who weaponized torture. Aerion Brightflame, 9.5, 10. All of Ramsay's calculated cruelty, plus genuine madness, plus a longer duration, plus a higher body count, plus generational trauma. The only reason I don't give Aerion a perfect 10-10 is because I reserve that for someone who might have evil on an even larger scale, like if Aerion had actually become king, or if he'd had access to wildfire as a weapon rather than just as his suicide method. But make no mistake, Aerion Brightflame was a monster. Not a tragic villain, not a misunderstood antagonist, not someone corrupted by circumstances, just a monster. A beautiful, charming, articulate monster who genuinely believed he was a dragon and treated everyone around him accordingly. Prince Aerion Brightflame died screaming in 232 AC, burned alive from the inside by his own delusion. And the world became safer for it. His brother Aemon called it a kindness from the gods. His father Maekar had already disowned him. His son Maegor was denied the throne because people feared he might be like his father. Even his own family wanted to erase his legacy. And yet, we still talk about him today because Aerion represents something that fantasy literature and historical fiction need. A reminder that evil isn't always grand or operatic. Sometimes evil is just a broken person with too much power and not enough constraints. George R.R. Martin created Aerion as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power, the tragedy of hereditary madness, the failure of institutions to protect the vulnerable, the long shadow that cruelty casts across generations. When A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms premieres on HBO, viewers are going to meet Aerion Brightflame for the first time, and I genuinely think he's going to disturb people more than Joffrey or Ramsay did. Because Joffrey and Ramsay were overtly monstrous, you could see them coming, but Aerion looks like a fairy tale prince. He's beautiful and charismatic and knows exactly what to say. And then he breaks your fingers because you put on a puppet show where a dragon lost. That's the real horror of Aerion Brightflame. Not that he was a monster, plenty of people are monsters, but that he was a monster who looked like a prince, thought like a dragon, and died like a fool. So yes, to answer our original question one final time, Prince Aerion Brightflame was more evil than Joffrey and Ramsay combined. Not necessarily in any single act, but in the totality of his existence, the duration of his cruelty, and the depth of his madness. He was the prince who thought he was a dragon. And in the end, he burned like one. Thanks for watching this deep dive into one of the most disturbing characters in the Game of Thrones universe. If you enjoyed this analysis, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Let me know in the comments. Do you think Aerion was more evil than Joffrey and Ramsay? Or do you think his madness makes him less morally culpable for his actions? I'm genuinely curious to hear your thoughts. Also, let me know if you want more deep dives on obscure Game of Thrones characters. There are so many fascinating figures in Westerosi history that never made it to the show, and I'd love to explore more of them. If you're excited about A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, make sure to check out my other videos on the Dunk and Egg novellas. We've got content on Bloodraven, the Blackfire Rebellions, and the Great Bastards. Until next time, remember, when someone tells you they're a dragon, maybe don't give them access to wildfire.